The wind had teeth that night, long and cold and mean. It scraped across the plains with a hunger that turned the tall grass sideways and made the horses in their stalls kick at shadows. Above, the sky groaned low, thick with storm clouds that hadn't yet opened but promised to soon. The manor at the edge of town, grand as a courthouse and twice as empty, stood lit in oil lamps, its windows gleaming like gold teeth in the dark. She came walking up the long, graveled lane, as if summoned by something older than time. Her dress clung wet to her knees, the color of ash and frost. Hair like riverweed in flood stuck to her cheeks. One boot had split at the sole and flapped with every step. She didn't look up at the windows, just kept her eyes on the heavy door and the brass knocker shaped like a lion's mouth. The butler who opened the door squinted as if the rain itself offended him. He saw the girl, thin as fence wire and half-drowned, and stepped back without inviting her in. For a breath, there was silence, broken only by the moan of the wind sliding through the porch rails like a whispering child. She spoke just 2 words, soft and round-edged, as if they hurt her to say, "Help me." From behind the butler came a voice, deep practiced, rich with the casual cruelty of a man used to deciding fates. He stepped into view with polished boots and a waistcoat stitched finer than any church vestment. His hair was trimmed sharp, his smile not warm. She didn't flinch when he stepped closer, nor when he looked her over like a gambler weighing the odds of a losing hand. His lip curled, just slightly. He said her name, the old one, the name she'd been given at birth, the one that still lived in whispers around the town like a bad story that won't settle. The name she'd come here to bury. "You're still breathing," he said. "Didn't expect that." She didn't answer. He sighed like a man refusing dessert. "I don't know what brought you here, but I can't help you. Not anymore." He turned. The butler closed the door. She stood there another minute, maybe 2. Rain began to fall in earnest, not in drops, but in sheets, thick and unrelenting. It soaked her hair to her scalp and filled the cracks in her boots. She turned, slow as sorrow, and walked back into the night, away from the house, the fire, the dry, and the last man who might have saved her. The road turned to mud. Lightning cracked sideways across the sky like a whip, casting the prairie in a brief, pale light. And in that flicker, she saw a fence line, broken in places, sagging under weight of neglect, and far beyond it, the silhouette of a stable, and beside it, a house with only one window lit. The stable door groaned as she pushed it open. The horses inside shifted, but none bucked. The hay smelled of rain and leather. A man sat at the far end, crouched by a post. His coat was old, patched. He didn't startle, just looked at her with eyes the color of old river stones, pale gray, unmoved. He said nothing. She said nothing. He stood, wiped his hands on a cloth, then walked past her and disappeared into the house. She stood there, dripping, heart loud in her ears. Part of her wanted to follow. Part of her feared she'd find another shut door. But he returned. In his hands, a thick wool blanket, a tin cup of water, and half a loaf of bread that smelled faintly of sage. He placed them on the bench near the stall and pointed to the far corner where the hay was clean and dry. "Wind pulls in from the west. That corner stays warmer." That was all he said. She nodded once. A thank you buried in silence. He left her there. The door swung closed with the sound of wood-trusting wood. She ate only half the bread, drank all the water, wrapped herself in the blanket, and slept with her hand still curled around the tin cup. That night, her dreams were shallow, but free of voices. No footsteps chasing her, no doors slamming, just wind and thunder and the slow beat of horse hooves nearby, like a lullaby from something steady and alive. Dawn came gold and thin. The storm had passed, but left behind a sky washed clean. She stepped outside and stood barefoot in the mud, blinking at the sun. The house still stood quiet. The man, whoever he was already out near the field, shoulders bent, turning the earth with a hoe and an old rhythm. He moved like someone who didn't owe anyone anything. She left the blanket folded on the bench and began to walk away. She made it 10 paces before she heard a soft voice behind her. "Didn't say you had to go." She turned. He didn't look up from his work. She swallowed. I've got nothing to pay with. You're not taking anything. I can't stay long. Didn't ask. The host sank into the dirt again. He kept going, as if her presence or absence wouldn't change the soil's hunger for seed. She looked down at her hands. Mud under the nails. Skin pink and raw from wind and rain. I can weed, she said. He paused, just once, then nodded toward the second row. That was the first morning. There would be others, with more words, more meals, more moments of stillness. But that morning, when she crouched in the dirt beside a man who never asked who she'd been before, was the first time she began to believe she could be someone else. Someone who belonged to something steady. Behind them, the manor house stood silent and high, its windows empty now. Rain had come with her. But where it went next, that was up to her. The days that followed settled like silt in a slow-moving river, quiet, unnoticed at first, then firm beneath the feet. She rose before the rooster each morning, swept the stalls, cleaned the troughs, and never waited to be told. The man said little, sometimes only pointed. But there was no hardness in it, just the way of someone who'd long made peace with silence. The ranch was no grand spread. A fence line held together with faith and bent nails. Chickens with half-feathered necks. A small herd of cattle that grazed more dirt than grass. But it breathed. Unlike the mansion on the hill, this place had lungs and warmth and rooms that exhaled when you entered. He wasn't young, 30, perhaps, or a hard 40. The kind of man whose face kept secrets without effort. Strong hands, scarred and calloused. Wore the same shirt 3 days running, patched at the elbow. His voice came seldom, but when it did, it had weight. Never lifted high, never dropped low. Just steady, like hooves on packed earth. She never asked his name. He never asked hers. That suited them both. At night, she slept in the loft above the stable, wrapped in that same wool blanket. She made a pillow of burlap and straw. The scent of horses, hay, and sweat became comfort. Some nights, the wind scraped across the plains like a whisper, trying to crawl back into her dreams. But the stables creaked gently around her, as if the beams themselves were standing guard. There were no questions about where she'd come from. No guesses. Just a quiet agreement that pasts belonged to the dust. One afternoon, while she carried buckets from a well, the heel of her boot gave way. She stumbled, spilled water, cursed under her breath. When she returned from the barn with twine to mend it, a pair of work boots sat outside the stable door. Older but dry, a size too big. She looked toward the house. He stood in the shade of the porch, whittling a block of cedar. Didn't say a word, just went back to carving. So she wore them. Later that week, she brought in eggs. Some cracked, but most whole. He nodded when she placed them on the table. "You cook?" he asked, not looking up from a ledger. She hesitated. "If you don't mind dry biscuits and burned edges. Fire's yours tomorrow." That was all. The first breakfast was rough. Burned bacon. Uneven flapjacks. He didn't comment, just ate slowly. But the next day, he left a small jar of lard and some fresh ground coffee beans on the counter. The third day, she found a tin of cinnamon. Neither of them spoke about it. In town, the talk had begun. A few murmurs in the dry goods store. Longer looks at the feed depot. She noticed at first, women stiffening their shoulders, men watching too long. She said nothing. He noticed too. They loaded the wagon in silence, save for the creak of ropes and the rustle of burlap sacks. When one man spat near her feet and muttered a name like a bruise, the rancher didn't flinch. Just turned, slow and deliberate, and looked the man in the eye until he stepped back without another word. They rode home in silence. She gripped the seat rail with white knuckles, not from fear, but from the effort of not breaking down. That night, she sat on the porch and watched the stars crawl out across the sky. He joined her with a mug of coffee, handed her one without asking. "They'll talk," she said after a long while. "They always do." "You're not curious?" He sipped. "What you do now means more than where you ran from." She stared into the dark, a knot forming just below her ribs. "I didn't run." He nodded. "All right." Just like that. No push, no pry. Just space, sacred and silent. She found herself staying closer after that. Not from fear. From something softer. Gratitude, maybe. Or the pull of a place that asked nothing but offered something better than mercy. Dignity. She helped him mend the roof. Caught the chickens when they scattered. Once, when he stepped wrong in the creek and twisted his ankle, she wrapped it with surprising care. He didn't thank her. Just said, "You got a good touch," and kept whittling. He carved animals, mostly. A horse mid-gallop. A fox mid-prowl. He gave one to her without ceremony. A small sparrow, wings tucked, feathers etched with patience. She kept it by her bedroll. One morning, a letter arrived. Delivered by the boy who worked the station. The rancher read it, folded it once, then twice more, and tucked it into the back of the ledger. Said nothing. That night, he didn't come in for supper. She found him outside, sitting in the dark with only the cattle and the wind for company. "You all right?" she asked. He glanced up. "I had a brother once." She waited. "Left years ago." Said he'd send word when he made something of himself. She sat down beside him. "This is first letter?" He nodded. Said he made it. "In gold, women, and liquor." "Sounds hollow," she said. Letter came thick with perfume and guilt. They sat there, silence folding over them like a second skin. "You ever want to leave here?" he asked suddenly. She looked out across the field, where moonlight glinted off the tools left in the dirt. "I came here because there was nowhere left. Now I stay because it's the first place I've been where silence doesn't feel like a punishment." He turned his head just slightly. "That's worth something," he said. The air shifted then, not romantic, not sudden. Just something shared. A tether formed not of touch or vow, but of understanding. The kind that held strong through storms and years and grief. Later that night, as she lay curled beneath the wool blanket, she ran her thumb over the carved sparrow. Outside, the wind carried the scent of dust and sage. The stable beams creaked soft again, like an old song playing low. And for the first time in years, she let herself hope the next day would not hurt more than the last. There were no declarations, no plans, but the rhythm between them had begun to shape itself into something steady, something safe, not a fire, but an ember that might just last through winter. And that, she thought before sleep took her, might be enough for now. Spring settled soft across the valley like a balm. The earth loosened, the fields greened, and wildflowers crept up between the fence posts like they'd been waiting their whole lives for this moment. Even the horses grew restless, snorting and kicking as if the sky itself had grown lighter. But in town, spring didn't always bring warmth. The general store was quiet when they stepped in. She carried the list: oats, flour, salt, 2 needles, and a roll of twine. He walked beside her, boots heavy but unhurried. They didn't speak much in public. He let her take the lead. That, more than anything, made folks whisper. The clerk, a narrow man with wire-rimmed spectacles and too many opinions, watched them over the edge of his ledger. His wife stood behind the counter pretending to dust, though her eyes followed the girl like a shadow. She didn't flinch. Not this time. In the corner, an older woman muttered something under her breath as they passed. Another coughed with intention. The rancher picked up a bag of feed like he hadn't heard. But he had. She could tell by the stillness in his shoulders. They finished the list quickly. Paid in coin, not credit. As they stepped outside, the sun met them with open arms, but the air still carried the weight of what had been left unsaid inside. At the wagon, she turned to him. "They know who I am." He adjusted the straps on the sack. "Maybe. They remember." He met her eyes. "And I thought maybe enough time had passed." He shook his head once, not unkindly. Time passes different when you're not the one bleeding. She looked down at her hands. They were healing, skin tougher now, nails trimmed, palms lined with labor. She'd earned new strength. But it wasn't armor, not in a place that remembered sins louder than kindness. They rode in silence, the creak of the wagon filling the spaces where thoughts sat heavy. That night, she brought out the coffee and poured 2 mugs. The fire popped gently in the hearth, and the smell of roasted chicory filled the space between them. "Would you want to know?" she asked, staring into her cup. He didn't look up from sharpening the blade he held. If you needed to tell it. I don't know if I do. Then I don't need it. She nodded, grateful. But the story was there now, pressing against her ribs. My father worked the mines east of Carson Ridge, she said after a while. He drank what little money we had and blamed me when we went hungry. He looked up, said nothing, but the blade stilled in his hand. Once when I was 15, he traded a parcel of land he didn't own just to pay off a debt to a man with softer hands and sharper teeth. A pause. I ran. She sipped from her mug. The coffee had gone lukewarm, bitter. The rest came after. One mistake after another. I tried cleaning for a family near the river, but their son was worse than my father. Then came the man in the mansion. He wanted a ghost, not a wife. I gave him neither. The rancher didn't move, but the blade, still dull, was laid aside. I never took anything that wasn't mine, she said, but I've been treated like I did. He leaned forward, forearms on his knees, gaze steady. You didn't knock on my door looking for forgiveness, he said. You were looking for shelter. That's different. She let the words sit. Not just heard, believed. Outside, a coyote called once far off. I don't want to keep running, she whispered. Then don't. Simple. Like choosing a path because it was dry, not because it was easy. A week later, the whispers found legs. She heard them behind her in the bakery. Saw them follow her at church. A group of women walked out when she came in, and the preacher's eyes faltered as he tried to decide which side his sermon belonged on. She didn't cry. She just left quietly and never went back. That afternoon, she scrubbed the porch until her knuckles stung. He came home from the field with mud on his shirt and saw her kneeling, rag clenched tight. Bad day. She didn't answer. Instead, she stood, rag dripping, and met his eyes with something fierce and tired. You ever think folks like us were meant to be alone? He scratched at his beard. I think most folks confuse alone with peace. She let out a breath, not quite a laugh, not quite a sob. Then why does it feel like I'll always be just one story behind what people think I am? He shrugged gently. Because you're living it. They're just telling it. That night, he handed her a book. The pages were brittle. The cover, frayed leather. She opened it, a field journal full of pressed plants and notations in a neat, looping hand. I used to keep track of the soil, he said. How it changed after rain, how it healed after fire. She turned the pages slowly. It took years, he continued, but I started seeing patterns. Things grow back in places you wouldn't expect. Not always what you planted, but something. She ran her fingers over a pressed sprig of prairie clover. It had held its shape all this time. I don't have much to give, he said. She shook her head. You gave me straw and bread. Silence when I needed it. And now this. Their fingers brushed. She didn't pull away. By late spring, the tongues of town still wagged, but they wagged in circles. She stopped answering them. The firewood pile got higher. The bread rose better. The chickens stopped fleeing at her shadow. Something quiet and good was building itself beneath their feet. Not sudden, not sacred, but real. The field was ready for seed. She watched him work, shirt damp with sweat, hands in the soil, and wondered if maybe there was more to grow here than corn or barley. Something deeper. Something with roots that reached all the way through the bones. That night, she climbed to the loft and found the little carved sparrow resting where she'd left it. She held it against her heart and whispered to the night, I'm still here. And for the first time, it didn't sound like a question. The heat came in slow that summer, not in waves, but in layers, thickening the air one afternoon at a time until even the shade felt close. Cicadas hummed like fever dreams, and the horses stood motionless beneath the trees, tails twitching at flies. She wore her hair up now, not out of vanity, but to keep the sweat from her neck. Her hands had tanned and calloused, her eyes sharper than when she'd arrived, though still gentle in the quiet hours. He watched her more often, not with hunger, not with pity, just with that quiet steadiness he wore like old boots, well-earned, broken in, and dependable. They worked side by side, without speaking much. A fence needed mending near the south pasture. She held the posts upright as he hammered. Dust clung to their clothes and throats, but the rhythm of the work was comforting. She found herself leaning into the silence more often than she feared it. It had become something like a language between them. That evening, after the tools were put away and the porch light flickered on, he handed her a small wooden box. He didn't say anything, just placed it beside her cup on the railing and walked inside. She didn't open it right away. The grain of the box was hand-smoothed, its hinges careful and fine. Inside, nestled in wool, lay a brooch carved of riverstone, soft gray-blue, shaped like a willow leaf. No jewels. No name etched into its back. Just the weight of it, solid and certain, shaped by time and water. She traced the edges with her thumb, unsure what he meant by it, yet knowing exactly. The brooch stayed in her pocket for 3 days. She'd pull it out in the quiet moments, near the well or while sifting flour, and feel the shape of something unspoken pressing into her palm. On the 4th morning, a knock came to the door. The butler answered. He'd ridden from the manor house on a pale gelding, sweating in his starched collar. Dust clung to his boots, and his words carried the weight of someone delivering a favor they did not believe in. "There's been a request," the man said stiffly, looking anywhere but her eyes. "From the gentleman who you previously knew." She said nothing. He cleared his throat. "He invites you to visit. Alone." She stood still, a burlap sack in her hands. The rancher paused mid-step behind her. Neither spoke. "He says he wishes to apologize, and to offer something more appropriate than before. A home, a name, a future." The words fell like stones. She met the butler's eyes then, not with anger, not even with surprise, just a long, steady quiet that made him shift in place. She didn't answer him, simply turned back toward the chicken coop and resumed her task. That night, she found the rancher sitting by the fire, a bowl of stew in his hands, boots unlaced. She sat beside him without a word. The flames licked the logs with a soft hiss, casting flickers across the walls. "I heard," he said. "I figured. You going?" She stirred her stew. "Would it change anything if I said yes?" He took his time. "No." She looked at him. "Not even a little." He shook his head. "You're not a thing to keep." "I'm not sure what I am." He gave a small shrug. "You're a person who could have run. Who didn't." She leaned back in her chair, arms folded, the steam from the bowl curling between them. "He has money, safety, a clean reputation." The rancher looked into the fire. "So does a coffin." They didn't speak for a while. She left the stew half-eaten and walked outside. The moon was high, sharp and silver, turning the dirt pale and the grass almost blue. Crickets rose up in chorus. The air was heavy with the scent of sage. She pulled the riverstone brooch from her pocket, turned it over in her hands. She didn't wear it. Not yet. At dawn, she saddled the old mare and rode out. Not toward the manor, but to the far fence line, where the land dipped down into the edge of the woods. She needed space to think, and the fields didn't ask questions. When she returned, the sun was high, and the air smelled like dry wheat and wood smoke. She found him in the shed, sharpening the plow blade. "I'm not going," she said. He didn't stop working. "I'm not going because he wants a version of me that never existed. But I'm not asking you to make promises either." The rasp of metal stopped. He turned to her, slow, with that steady weight she'd come to expect. "I don't have promises," he said, "but I have presence. I'll be here when you wake up. I'll eat what you cook, and I'll fix what you break. And if the barn catches fire, I'll run toward it with both hands and a prayer." She stepped closer. "I don't want to be taken in. I know. I want to stay because I choose it, not because I'm afraid." He nodded. Then she took the brooch from her pocket and placed it on the table between them. Not on her dress, not in his hands, but where both could see it. "I'll wear it," she said, "when I believe I've earned it." He didn't smile, just looked at the brooch like it was something worth waiting for. That night, she sat alone on the porch, watching the stars slip into place. She thought about names, the ones people gave you, the ones they took away, the ones you carved out for yourself in silence and long days of work. She didn't need anyone to speak the words aloud. The proposal had already happened. Not in a church, not on one knee, but in the way he'd left the door unlatched when she first arrived, in the boots outside the stable, in the way he didn't ask her story until she gave it. She fell asleep that night with a brooch on her chest, right above her heart, and the fire still warm in the hearth. And somewhere between the last breath of dusk and the first sigh of dawn, she dreamed not of running, not of hiding, but of building something, slow, steady, and hers. The storm broke in the late hours, sudden, hard, and full of fury. Lightning cracked across the sky, like the earth itself had torn loose from something holy. The rain came sideways, smashing against windows, flooding the yard in minutes. Horses kicked in their stalls, nostrils flaring, the old mare crying out like something ancient. She woke first, heart already racing, drawn to the sound of a crack louder than thunder. It came again, not from the sky, but from below. A hollow, splintering sound. With giving way, she ran barefoot across the porch, the wind lifting her shift like wings. The barn, the smaller one near the grove, was lit at its base, orange flickering against the dark. Fire. By the time he reached her side, already pulling on his coat, the flames had caught the dry straw outside and begun crawling up the walls. "Go for the pump," he said, already moving. She didn't argue. Buckets. Buckets, water, and the pump that stuck on every third pull. The fire spat sparks like curses, licking the eaves, hungry. She didn't feel the heat at first, only the pressure of smoke in her chest, the ache in her arms. He was inside before she could scream his name, pulling the last horse free, arms blackened with soot, eyes wild with purpose. The beast kicked past him into the storm, almost dragging him down. He stumbled, fell, rose again. A second crash. The beam above the tack room gave way, collapsing in fire and weight. She ran toward him without thinking. The barn groaned, alive with heat and pain. He staggered into view just as she reached the edge, coughing hard, his shirt burning along one arm. She threw a bucket at him, grabbed another, doused his back. "Are you mad?" he rasped. "Yes," she snapped. "You first." They got the rest out with grit and desperation. The sky opened, and the rain did its part at last, dampening the flames enough to let them finish. When it was over, what stood of the barn was smoke and bone, a shell blackened and steaming in the gray light of dawn. They sat against the fence, dripping, filthy, too tired to speak. He cradled his arm, burned along the forearm and wrist, skin blistering. She tore her shift and wrapped it without ceremony. "You should have waited," she said quietly. "I don't wait when things I love are inside a fire." She stilled. He didn't look at her when he said it, but the words hung there, suspended in the smoke and the space between their ribs. Then, through the fading hiss of rain on embers, came the sound of hoofbeats. She turned. The butler again, though not in fine wear this time. His face was pale. The message was brief. "There's been an investigation," he said, not daring to dismount. "The marshal says the fire wasn't started by lightning." She looked to the barn. The scent of oil still lingered in the ash. "Your master?" she asked. He didn't deny it. "There's talk of charges," the butler added. "He's not well. Drinking. Talking to himself. Keeps saying you were his mistake to correct." The rancher rose slowly, arm stiff. "You'll leave now," he said. Not angry. Just final. The butler obeyed. They stood in the wreckage. She touched the brooch at her collar, worn now where the cloth had burned around it. "I've run from things all my life," she said. "Fire. Men. Words." He waited. "But today I ran into the fire. For you." He looked at her. "I know. I think I know what that means." "So do I." She reached into her pocket, pulled out a folded slip of paper, the last page of his journal, torn neatly. She'd written on it in her own hand the night before. Just a few lines. Nothing fancy. "If you'll have me, I'll stay. Not as a shadow. Not as a debt. But as a woman with a name. Yours, if you'll give it." He read it. Twice. Then folded it once more and tucked it inside the breast pocket of his shirt. "I'm not a man for ceremony," he said. "I know. But I built this place for something steady. I didn't know it'd be you." She stepped closer, lifted his injured hand, and kissed the unburned edge of his knuckle. I was always meant to be steady, she whispered. Just never had the soil for it. He smiled then, tired and cracked, but real. Then let's build it. From ash if we have to. The next week, they planted the southern field with beans. She stitched a new curtain for the kitchen window. The barn would take time to rebuild, but the frame went up slow and true. The town still whispered, but something in the way she walked made them quieter. Not afraid, just unsure how to name a woman who had stood in fire and come out holding her own future. One evening, he stood beside her on the porch, watching the stars grow bold above them. He said her name, the new one, the one she'd taken without asking, the one he'd given by simply loving her well enough that it fit. She turned to him. It suits me, she said. Yes, he answered. It always did. And out on the prairie, with smoke behind them and sky ahead, they stood not as rescuer and rescued, but as two people who had chosen one another, without demand, without fear, and without shame. Some storms, after all, don't come to break us. They come to burn away the rot, and leave only what's worth keeping.